Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Imagine being of one race, but giving up your entire identity, your name, family, relatives, lifestyles, values, children, everything, and living as someone of a different race. That's the premise of Passing. Very fair-skinned African Americans who, for a variety of reasons, decide to pass as white. Up next on Another View, we'll talk about this phenomenon with Donna Drew Sawyer, author of Provenance, a novel, and historian Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. It's an Another View history lesson, and it's next, so stay tuned.
Discussing today's topics from an African American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. So today's show is all about having history and living history and enjoying history. And I'm going to start by telling you about two things that are going on in our community that are historic, history related, that I think that you would be very interested in attending, perhaps. The First Baptist Church of Williamsburg, which was founded in 1776 by both enslaved and free blacks. They are celebrating their 241st anniversary this coming Sunday, and they invite you to join them for service at 11 a.m., and that's at 727 West Scotland Street in Williamsburg. It's a beautiful building, and also the bell from that church was used at the Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. during the opening. So lots of history there. If you'd like to attend, they welcome you to come. Also, attorney Philip J. Hirschkopf will be speaking at the Virginia Beach Forum on Monday, October the 16th. His name may not be familiar, but he was the attorney who represented Martin Luther King and Norman Mailer, and also argued the case on behalf of Mildred and Richard Loving in the 1967 case Loving v. Virginia. And that was all about the opportunity for people of mixed races to marry. So he will be speaking at the Virginia Beach Forum on Monday, October the 16th, and we have tickets, free tickets for 6 people or for 3 callers, 2 tickets each. If you call 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240, the first 3 callers right now will receive vouchers to attend Monday, October the 16th at Cape Henry Collegiate School on Mill Dam Road in Virginia Beach. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 to hear Philip J. Hirschkopf talk about Loving v. Virginia. And so hopefully you will take advantage of some of the opportunities to explore history throughout Hampton Roads. And today, simply put, passing occurs when members of a racial, ethnic, or religious group present themselves as belonging to another such group. It has happened a lot in the Black community, particularly during slavery and the Jim Crow era. Passing allegedly allowed Blacks to live a better lifestyle as a white person, but the sacrifice was enormous. We're going to talk about passing in this Another View history lesson with our favorite historian, Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. Hey, Cassandra, how are you?
How are you?
I'm doing great. And joining me by phone is Donna Drew Sawyer, author of Provenance, a novel, which is a fictional story of Hank Whitaker and his life once he decided to pass. Hello, Donna. How are you? I'm doing great. Thanks so much for joining us today. So let me start with you, Cassandra, just in terms of, I gave a really short kind of definition of passing, but when I've mentioned this throughout the week, as people have been talking about the show, they look at me kind of quizzically. So explain a little bit about what passing is, and then Donna, I'll come to you.
Well, as you clearly said, passing is when you're pretending that you're one race and you're pretending to be another. And that means that your physical characteristics are undefined or relay another image.
So much to the other, to another group.
So Carol Channing, for example, passed as being completely white when her father was actually biracial. He was half white and half black. And so she colored her hair, made sure that her image was always that of a very white person. So she made sure she stayed out of the sun. She used very bright colors when she was making up her face to ensure that when people looked at her, they saw a white woman as opposed to someone who could potentially be a mixed race individual. Now, you also have, which is lesser known, passing by whites pretending to be something else. And the big controversy over the NAACP, yes, yeah. That's an example. And it's actually happened a lot. The Color of Water, about the young man who grew up believing that his mother was black and she was actually white. And in order for her to marry and to be part of a family with this black man and her children, she was Jewish and she pretended to be black. And so there have been some incidences, probably more than we realize, of that, or white actors pretending to be Hispanic or pretending to be of other races. And I don't mean just temporarily for a film.
You're talking about actually immersing themselves.
Yes, as part of their character. And they would get lots and lots and lots of roles with people believing that.
Mm-hmm. So, and how did the one-drop rule play into this back in terms of slavery and then moving into segregation? Because during slavery times with the one-drop rule, that's how they were able to keep people who had become mixed because of the master and sleeping with the slaves and so forth, to make sure that they maintained a workforce.
That was part of the reason. There was also a need to create white privilege because, if you go back to Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 here in Virginia, when blacks and whites who were of the same class. They were in the same class. Some of them were servants, most were enslaved who were black, but then the white indentured servants, they saw their situation as being similar, and they almost overthrew the Virginia government. And after that, you really had a lot of concerns about whites and blacks who were of that same socioeconomic level getting together and potentially actually overthrowing the government next time. And so Virginia instituted white privilege, essentially. There were entitlement laws that they started designating into the law that only this applies to white men. And by extension, white women, as long as they had a white man protecting them. And so the rights of free blacks started declining precipitously because of that. And so even though a lot of states had this one-drop rule, they never applied that one-drop rule. There were so many people who continued to be enslaved, whose mothers in some cases were white, and they were supposed to by law be freed, but they were not. You had lots of people who were sent away. Thomas Jefferson sent most of his children to other states because that one-drop rule was supposed to have applied to them, but it did not apply to them, or the law just wouldn't allow it to apply to them. And so instead of keeping them in the state and enslaved, he sent them to other places and let them be white if they chose to be white. And so a lot of people did that, but it was during the segregation period, during the period following Reconstruction, that there was an increased need by white society to marginalize blacks. And that's when that one-drop rule began being applied to African Americans. And so you would see, I show my students all the time school pictures, and they say, wow, I didn't know there were integrated schools at that time. No, it's not, integrated. These are all black people, but you can see the racial or the color diversity within African Americans, and that was very critical in that post-Reconstruction period to separate and segregate out even black people who were looking white. So this whole idea of passing really became even more of an issue, not an issue of freedom from slavery, but now liberty, where you have access to all the full civil rights of American society.
So Donna, Provenance, a novel, is the story of Hank Whitaker and what happens to him when he decides to pass. Can you set up for us why he made this decision? What was going on?
Well, the truth of the matter is that the decision was forced upon him. He didn't. It was made in a split second in a situation that he found himself in. He and his brothers had gone over to a baseball game over at Hampton, and could not get back across the water before they could get to their sundown town, where they were not allowed to be in town when the sun went down. African Americans had to be out of town at that time, and so he and his brothers were set upon by the sheriff and his deputies. And in order to get away, he hitched the ride to Richmond, and he was told by friends and family that the sheriff, who had been racing to catch him, had a heart attack and died, and so he was wanted for murder. So to get away, he left town and ended up in Richmond, Virginia, and everybody thought he was a white man. And the privilege that he started to experience was something he had never experienced before. And so that was his introduction to what the other side of color looked like. And so he started passing as a white man. And after marrying a white woman and being accepted by society and starting a business, there was no turning back for Hank Whitaker.
But he still was tormented. I mean, he never
absolutely
fully immersed himself in the culture.
He had such a wonderful family life in his hometown of Llewellyn that it just tortured him. That he would never introduce his son to his father or his brothers. That they would never experience the same kind of culture that he grew up in, which was a close culture of friends and family. And as he says in one of the lines I wrote in the book, is that they didn't really put on pretenses in his family. You valued somebody by who they were, not what they had. And so those are the things that he missed when he moved into white society. And so it was a torturous existence for this man, and one that eventually he wanted to share with his wife and his son, but knew that would destroy the life he knew then. He'd already had one life destroyed. He didn't know how to destroy the next one.
So what made you write this novel? I mean, I've known you for a long time, and full disclosure, Donna and I are friends, and Donna used to live here in Norfolk, in Hampton Roads, and worked at the Chrysler Museum and so forth. But I had no idea you were as creative in terms of this book. It is truly a novel that when I started reading it, I could not put it down. I took it around with me just so that every time I'd have a couple minutes, I could just delve back into it.
Well, it was a strange progression from the first page of Provenance to the last. I read a book many years ago by Anella Larson called Passing. And this book was written in 1929. And then, those kinds of books, it's about a woman who meets a friend of hers who is passing. And this woman is able to pass, but she chose not to. And it's about how their lives diverge and then converge again. And it was very interesting to me how the woman who chose to pass was tortured by the fact that she missed everything that had come before the moment she married her husband and began to pass, married a white man and began to pass. And so I guess that, in my small creative mind that started churning up characters, and something about being a writer is that you take your experiences with you, whether you know it or not. And so those weave themselves into stories and ideas, and I started keeping a folder of just glimpses of ideas about this book. And I also read a book called Passing Strange by Dr. Martha Sandowitz, and this was a book about a scientist and a surveyor back in the early 19th century by the name of Clarence King, and he did the opposite. He was a white man, and he passed as a black man in order to marry a black woman. And so all of these racial mashups started to play itself out in a family by the name of Whitaker that I created. And it was really an attempt to tell the story of gain and loss, of identity, of culture, of spirit, and that nobody gets a free pass.
You know, it's really interesting that the when you talk about gain and loss, because that is the one thing that fictionally as well as in true life, people really lost a lot in terms of,
Absolutely.
even though they thought by becoming a white person that they would be able to live better and they'd be able to make more money and they'd be able to live in a better neighborhood and all those kinds of things, but they truly had to cut themselves completely off from family, from everything that they knew. I mean,
and the question is, when you do that, at what cost?
Exactly.
And there's no finite cost. It just, in my character's situation, it just continued to evolve.
Sure did.
The payment he had to make for that existence got bigger and bigger and bigger, and was amplified by his having a son the age he was when he began to pass. So it is, there are 3 generations in this book that are clouded racially. And I wanted to show also the difference between men passing and women passing. There was a solid difference in one of my characters who came to the book late, as a matter of fact, and everybody seems to love to hate. And her name was Charlotte. And the way she came into existence in the book made her journey very different from her son-in-law's journey through racial times and situations.
Absolutely.
So Provenance, the meaning of the word is where you come from and what your roots are. And you can use it in an art term, you can use it for people. And I thought that's what I wanted for this book, is to have people think about what came before and the results of what's after.
So, Cassandra, let's talk about, from a historical perspective, some of the things that people really did have to give up. I mean, because what would happen to them if they were discovered?
Well, it's always interesting to me when a man passes. He can always accuse, if their child looks a little black, he can always accuse his wife of having an affair. But if a woman passes, there's a whole different dynamic. That sort of father's maybe, mother's baby. And so then the jig is up, so to speak, when that happens. And so that issue of genetics that pops out, unbeknownst, sometimes generations later, is really all a part of the fear factor that goes in. This idea of being discovered. And that's true even today. You have a lot of people who are passing today, and people don't realize that. And society, white society in particular, has been very afraid of that for many, many years, which is why all of these stories of the tragic mulatta has dominated our cultural landscape. This notion that if you have a child that's mixed, you have a child that looks white but they're black, that they don't belong anywhere, that the black community rejects them, the white community, as long as they think they're white, they're fine, but the moment they realize they're black, they will reject them, and ultimately that individual will die. They'll kill themselves, or they'll live some sort of tragic life. And so there's been this very strong cultural pressure to keep people from passing, or to make that a very negative kind of thing. And of course, you think about Tiger Woods, for example. He was trying his best in his early years to not allow people to identify him as black.
Right, because he named a whole list of
the Cablazian thing.
Caitlin Asian, or yeah.
And of course he wasn't successful at all, because people, and this is what President Obama talked about in his books, that he understood that people are going to identify him as black. Mm-hmm. And so even though he was biracial, he had to decide for himself who he was going to be. And so for many African Americans who are light-skinned or could pass for white, those who chose to self-identify as black had to, or they did that to hold on to their family and to hold on to their culture and to hold on to their communities, because they valued that and saw that as how human beings define themselves, more so than privilege or more so than money. Mm-hmm. And I'm also reminded of the book and the film that came out in 2008 called Skin. And it was about a South African family who were British South African, and their daughter. This was based on an actual story of a woman who was born in 1955. Her name was Lang, and she came out looking very dark-skinned and clearly African or African. She was black. At least there was some recognition with her hair, with her skin complexion, that she was black, but the parents were white. And so then all kinds of questions arose about whether the mother had an affair, and it turns out that after doing testing, they found out that gene was in their family.
So they had someone black in their family,
right?
All
and
along.
They had, quote, forgotten about that. And that became an issue, and she, of course, had to make a decision because white society would not really allow her to live as a white person. And so she had to identify, but in identifying, she broke with her family. She had to separate herself completely from her family. And there was a tremendous price for that.
Donna, in the book, Hank, when Cassandra was talking about the birth of a child, Hank went through a lot of changes when his son was going to be born, because he was worried that was going to be the thing to give up the secret.
Right. He had, by that time, become, very prominent in Richmond society. He had married a woman who was prominent in society. His mother-in-law and father-in-law were very prominent in society. And he had a business that was thriving. And this one small child could destroy all of that. And so, the scene where he is waiting outside the door to find out if he is the father of a white child or a brown child is agonizing. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to do it from his perspective because that's one of the private things that, you would not see if you were looking at a man or a woman who passed. What are the things that really put them in danger? It isn't somebody outside finding them out. It's the betrayal within their own household. Mm-hmm. And the other thing was that he had a housekeeper who he felt was more like his mother than, or a motherly figure than anyone, because she reminded him of his past, of his mother, and how his mother raised him. And the thought of her helping him to raise his son was something that gave him a lot of comfort. And he made sure that he didn't ever treat the name of the housekeeper was Dell, like a servant, but like, a colleague, companion, co-parent to his son, because she gave him the same sort of upbringing and, the culture of an African-American family. Mm-hmm. So it was on one hand, having the child and having him turn out to look like a white child, to look like his father, but on the other hand, being able to be raised like an African American child. Was the best of both worlds for this man.
If you're just joining us, it's in Another View history lesson on the phenomenon of racial passing with historian Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander and Donna Drew Sawyer, author of Provenance, a novel. And I want to play a clip from Law and Order, my favorite show, as everybody knows. But this was a storyline called Blood, and it was about this very issue that we're talking about. I do want to let you know, audience, that you will hear the N-word in this clip, but I left it in for context based on this is Anita Van Buren, who is the lieutenant in Law and Order, speaking with a murder suspect about the fact that she has realized that he is passing. Let's take a listen.
Hello, my brother. Damn. Look at you. You did it. You passed. You know, I thought up close I'd be able to tell, but I swear I can't. So, what's it like when it's just you and them? You laugh along when they tell the jokes? Oh, you know what I'm talking about, right? Or do you tell nigger jokes too, just to keep up appearances?
If you don't mind.
Oh, am I sitting too close? Well, I remind you of somebody? Your mother? Was she dark-skinned? High yellow? Your red bone? You're scared now, aren't you? You've been scared for almost 40 years. And all that fear came gushing out Sunday morning. You panicked. Isn't that right? You go ahead. Tell me what happened. Take the weight off, my brother. You'll feel better.
Now, of course, if you're not a fan of Law and Order, Anita Van Buren is African American, and she's really talking to him. She's figured out, Cassandra, that he is passing, and she gives it to him pretty hard.
She included all the issues that were part of passing, and there's also an element of resentment that African Americans resent the fact that blacks who pass feel as if they have to abandon their culture, their heritage, in order to be a part of the whole. And in that abandonment, there's also denial, because there is I really despise the title of the book, The Black Stain. This idea that something that's black is negative, something that's black is a stain on your life or a stain on you. That whole concept is part of passing, or in so many ways part of how many African Americans regard those who pass.
So, and also for you, Donna, when you listen to that clip, and you're talking about the whole idea of being afraid for 40 years and take the weight off. I mean, that was also a part of the characters that you brought to life in Provenance. Yeah,
there's a scene in the book when Hank Whitaker finally reveals who he is to Dell, his confidant and housekeeper. And if you don't mind, I'd like to just read a little bit of that.
Sure, go ahead.
Because it really does, hits the same note that the Law and Order piece did. So Hank Whitaker says, "You have hands like my mother's. My mama was smart enough to teach school, but she scrubbed floors because that was the only work she could get from white folks. She was better read, more refined, generous, and humble than all the white folks in Richmond put together." Though he looked in Dell's direction, Hank's eyes were not looking at her. He spoke like he was back in Park Place. "She educated us, me and my brothers. We didn't have fancy schools like Lance, my son, go to here in Richmond. Shabby wreck of a school, but they taught us the best they could. My daddy was wise, smart as a whip, could quote from Shakespeare and the Bible, Hank laughed at that memory and then turned serious again. He could figure a row of numbers in his head and calculate a maximum crop yield without a single lick of school-taught arithmetic. He didn't need to know how much money a man had to decide if he was worth knowing. My parents understood character. Do you know what I mean, Del? My mama and daddy were strong, smart, honest, and proud, and they raised me and my brothers that way, too. Our little community was a family. People used to use common sense, generosity, humility, instead of taking these pretend social airs like white folks here in Richmond. Dell understood exactly without hearing the words. Mr. Hank was passing. All this time she had never suspected he was a Negro passing as white. So there, even though she lived in his house, she like, Lieutenant Van Buren said, unless you can get that close and still not know. It's a horrible pretense to think about somebody carrying that burden. And when the line when they said, you'll feel better, that's what was going on in this scene. He was unburdening himself to the only person he thought he could tell in all the world.
That he could trust. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call. Join our conversation. We're talking about passing. Do you know in your family line if there was anyone who ever tried passing? 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. So this whole idea of, it brings back to me also why it is so critical that we maintain and understand our culture. And because Cassandra, and both of you can respond to this, but because that seems to be the big thing that was missing out of all of this, was the fact that you could no longer recognize, acknowledge, or anything in terms of your culture.
And your culture is what defines you. Your culture is what you grew up with. It is part of your ancestral memory. And it is not easily cast aside. And so when you do cast it aside, there's a hole there. There's a missing piece to it. And so everything else is pretending.
Absolutely. What do you think also, Donna?
Well, one of the things that I tried to capture in the book was that aimlessness of culture that not only Hank felt, but then ultimately his son. Because as one of the characters in the book is that I wove several historical characters into the book, and one was a woman by the name of Belle DaCosta Green, who was the librarian at the Morgan Library, and she passed. She was a dusky-skinned African-American woman who passed as Portuguese. And she meets Hank's son. And one of the things she tells him is that he has to find, when she finds out he's passing, she tells him he has to find somebody that he can confide in. Because, as she put it, we have no tribe. And what she was saying to him is that there's no culture for people like us that are of color, but not in a community of color. So, that aimlessness, I think, is something that I wanted to explore because it for me being so wonderfully ensconced in my culture, that while I appreciate others, I don't know what I'd do without my own. And for these characters, they never found that place. And then there were other characters that I wove into it, like Eugene Ballard, who was an African-American man who was the what they call the Black Swallow, because he was an airman in the Lafayette Escadrille in Paris during World War I. And he integrated into French culture, but he was never fully accepted. Same thing with Josephine Baker, integrated into French society, never fully accepted. So these people are the ones who go without a tribe throughout their lives.
Wow. Lisa Godley, our producer, her next door neighbor, who is now passed, but he told her family about the fact that he passed for white as a doorman at a hotel in downtown Portsmouth so that he could get employment. People did it for many different reasons. Our phones are lit up, so let's take some calls. Sean in Newport News. Hi, Sean. You on the air?
Oh, good afternoon. How are you today?
Okay. How you doing?
All right. One of the rare times I can catch this television show, but I was and I enjoy it. But I was stating that I was thinking to myself back to some stories when my grandmother was growing up. She would tell me, being from this area, you have very specific genes. I can pick out who my people are just by looking at them. Sometimes they can pick me out too. But she had her cousins. She was telling me that she had some of her cousins who were white passing, and they were sisters. And one was darker than the other. When they got in a car accident, this was years and years ago, one sister was taken to the white hospital and the other sister was taken to the black hospital.
Wow.
When her uncle found out, everybody got in trouble because, my grandmother's family has always been free people of color. Actually, they're Native American, but they've always had land and they're Native American and black. And, always had land, always had money. But let's say you weren't going to treat one child better than the other. But that's how that happened.
Wow.
That's
Sean,
how that happened.
Thanks so much for sharing that story, Sean. We appreciate that. And that could be very true. Just by people judging just by the complexion.
Well, you think of
someone.
Benjamin Drew and how he was taken to a white hospital after he was in a car accident, and the people who were with him, they arrived shortly thereafter, and then they realized he was black. And in transit to the black hospital, he died. And this is the man who founded the blood bank.
Absolutely. Keith joins us from Norfolk. Hi, Keith. You're on the air.
Yeah, how you doing, man?
Okay.
Yeah, I had in high school, I had a teacher, typing teacher, who I knew for a fact was actually black, but passed as white. And he used to give me a hard time all the time because he was afraid that I would expose them.
Oh.
And not only that, but
how did you know? Did you know his family? How did you know?
Well, my family knew him.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And it's a good book came out years ago called Our Kind of People.
Uh-huh.
And it deals with, not only people passing as white, but also the skin issue as far as light skin, dark skin, which is still prevalent today.
Yeah, that's another, you know what, Keith, that's a whole nother topic. We're going to talk about that one day also. But you're absolutely right. Thanks so much for the call. We appreciate that. So here was someone who would, again, now that's interesting that the teacher would be in the same area, because most people also had to move away from, so not only did you give up your culture and so forth, but you also gave up the location where you lived.
Well, sometimes people change their names. So they may, you may have known what family they were from, but they were going by a different name. So, there were lots of those kinds of issues. Usually, though, during the time of slavery, they had to leave the area. Because lighter-skinned blacks were actually under even more scrutiny than darker-skinned blacks because of this issue of potentially passing. Think of Lewis Latimer, the famous inventor and draftsman. His father, George Latimer, was light enough to pass for white, but he didn't. But I suspect that's how he escaped from slavery from Norfolk. And this is an individual who was, his wife, Rebecca, was probably darker skinned. There are no pictures of her, but there are pictures of him, and he looks white. But when you see the drawing of him in his earlier years, I think they darkened it to make sure that people understood that this was a black man, because he became a cause célèbre. He was arrested, identified as a runaway slave up in Boston, arrested. John Quincy Adams was involved in helping to defend him. He was eventually given his freedom, got away, so to speak. And the fourth child of Rebecca and George was Lewis Latimer. And this is a man who was owned by his uncle. And so given his look, I would say he wasn't a mulatto, half white and half black. More than likely, he was either what they call a quadroon, which was 1/4 black, meaning one of your grandparents was black, or an octoroon. And from the accounts of Lewis Latimer, it sounds like he was an octoroon because they talked about his mother being a quadroon.
Wow. It is very complicated.
Well, I think it's so interesting that we have had all these names for, degrees of blackness and whiteness. And I think that's one of the things that really intrigued me about in doing research for this book. It was, it's amazing how race has made us try to separate ourselves from each other. There's a scene in the book where Hank, as a passing black man, has a conversation with a white man who's all for the Racial Integrity Act, which says that, there's no interracial marriage. And he's busy drinking at this party, and he thinks to himself, if he only knew who he was talking to.
Well, you remind me of something that has happened with my husband, who is light enough to pass for white. He's got blondish hair, blue eyes,
that's true.
and very pink skin. I tease him all the time about that. And over the years, he's had people who've talked to him not realizing he was black, and we're talking about white people and talking about black people, and he'll turn to them and say, excuse me, and and actually inform them that he's black, and that usually creates a lot of kerfuffle on their part because they're, and I've actually had a few times when people have walked up to me. I had a young girl, I was in a church, and this was a little young white girl, and she said, well, how are you adjusting to being in this church with so many black people? And I turned to her and I said, I'm black too. And her eyes, because her perception was that black people look specifically a certain way and everyone else is white.
Well, my daughter, Barbara knows, Jacqueline, my oldest daughter is very fair. And when she was born, she looked like a white baby. And a friend of mine came to visit me at the hospital and said, I went by, the nursery and saw the baby, and she's beautiful, beautiful brown-skinned baby, dark hair. And I said, that's not my baby. She goes, well, that was the only black baby in there.
Rachel joins us from Norfolk. Hi, Rachel. You're in the air.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show.
Sure.
My mom is very, very light. She's got green eyes and pale skin, but she's considered black. And so a lot of her relatives passed as white when they, during segregation times, for example. She had a relative who was in the Coast Guard, but he was a black man, but no one knew it, and that's how he could get that type of job, because he passed. She had other relatives who would go into hat shops and try on hats without putting a piece of paper between the hat and their head because they could pass. And I found that in a global context, that has advantages for me because I'm also very, very fair. And sometimes people don't recognize that I'm black. So when I go abroad, I can blend into so many cultures really easily and just kind of hide because it seems advantageous in a society that may not be friendly to Americans all the time. And so I find that it has global benefits in some cases.
Does it have benefits for you here in the United States where you live?
Say that I can hang on the fringe of the black community and the white community so that I can see perspectives of both. Or my white friends might say, well, you're not really black. Well, I say, yes, I am black, but I can kind of mingle between different groups to gain perspectives of how black people view white people or white people view black people or even other minorities.
Okay. Thanks so much for the call, Rachel. I appreciate that. It must be, I'm trying to imagine so you created this life, you've created this persona, and when you have to listen to other people denigrate who you are, but you can't say anything because you've created this whole persona. And Donna, you've already referenced this a little bit in terms of what happened with Hank and how he started drinking, but on a day-to-day basis, I'm quite sure that people who passed in real life had to deal with that.
Well, I can't even imagine. There's several scenes in my book where not just Hank, but his son Lance later in the book listen to people talk about African Americans. And there's one scene where Hank's son Lance is in Paris at a club, and the club was owned by Eugene Ballard. And this is a place that really existed. I put my fictional characters there. And the French are talking about, Les Baker, Josephine Baker, and how beautiful she is. And all he can think of is that the African American performers that he saw when he lived in the South, how they were loved and then reviled at the same time. How did they deal with that? And here he is in a situation where he knows he's black now, but he's listening to white people talk objectively as they are objects about African Americans. And his choice is to stay silent. And I'm sure, to preserve his future, he decides this is not something I can talk about.
Right, I can't delve into that. And we've got 2 minutes left. Donna, are you writing anything else?
I am. I'm writing a sequel to Provenance that deals with passing on a different level, and that is the way we've progressed in the 20th and 21st century, where it's not so much color, but your social relations that you're passing. You've seen groups where people are the only one. Well, this book talks about that kind of passing.
All right. Well, we will be looking forward to that. And I know you're also working with the arts in my hometown of Baltimore, and got a lot of exciting things that are going on there. So you'll have to keep us posted on what's happening.
I definitely will.
Okay. Thanks so much for joining us. That's Donna Drew Sawyer. She's the author of Provenance, a novel. And Dr. Newby-Alexander, you have the last 30 seconds.
Okay. What I was going to say, and this is kind of referencing a little bit of what Donna said, but also what the last caller said, and that is that many African Americans are often put in situations where they're forced to address issues having to do with stereotyping of black people and black behavior. And so people who are passing, they would usually just go with whatever the whites were saying. But for those who are not passing, I say do what I do, and that is challenge those stereotypes, because people are human beings ultimately.
Absolutely. Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, our favorite historian here on Another View from Norfolk State University. And we will be right back.
Hi, this is Essie Patha-Murkerson from Law and Order. You are listening to Another View.
Oh, that always makes me so happy. Anyway, if you grew up in Portsmouth, Virginia in the 1950s, places like Bailey's Barbershop or Kelly's Cab Stand are probably very familiar to you. Or maybe there are other places that hold a special place in your heart. If so, you won't want to miss an afternoon of remembering. It all happens next Sunday at the Portsmouth Colored Community Library Museum. Our Lisa Godley gives us a taste of what you might hear as several people take a stroll down memory lane.
Just let me hear some of that rock and roll music.
I have so many memories of things that I enjoyed doing that meant so much to me.
L. Bernice Wadley has vivid memories of what it was like living in downtown Portsmouth in the 1950s and 60s.
I went to private school. I went to Catholic school, so we had to walk to school every day, and every day was a different adventure. And I loved it so much because around where I lived was all the things that we thought that nobody else had but us. And that was like the original Tidewater building. I grew up right next door to the Tidewater building. It was built in 1906, and it was in the 400 block of South Green Street. That's one block off High Street. And there they had all kinds of things. And I met these ladies who were insurance women. Can you imagine in the 40s, black ladies carrying insurance books and stuff? And I thought that was so great. Was a man named Mr. Small who gave me my first job. His name was Victor Small, and he was an undertaker nevertheless. But he was the only licensed embalmer in the city of Portsmouth, so he not only did all the embalming for his funeral home, but for all the white funeral homes around, because he retired from the Navy, and that was what he did in the Navy. So all of these things were so good. I was an only child. I didn't have sisters and brothers, so I just walked around and visited everybody and was nosy in everybody's business.
Just a few miles away from downtown sits Portsmouth's Truxton community, where Lawrence Oles grew up, with wonderful memories of his time as a student at Norcom High School.
I attended IC Norcom High School between 1959 and 1963. One of my fondest memories, and I have to say one because I had so many, was my teacher, who is now Dr. William Ward, former mayor of Chesapeake, Virginia, former professor at Norfolk State University, who taught me in the 9th grade. From his influence, I majored in history and political science at Virginia Union University.
During that same time frame, not far away from Truxton, a very busy mid-city shopping center is bustling, and the Portsmouth community that Mae Breckenridge Haywood remembers fondly, Taylorsville, keeps local business owners, including Mae's own family, very busy.
The store was in the front of the house and was officially called the Busy Bee Cafe, but most of the people in the neighborhood called it the shop. The store had a Wurlitzer jukebox that played vinyl records. I believe that you put a nickel coin in it and it would play your music. We also had in that store display cases with assorted candies, just boxes of many things in the store. That store was my life.
Meanwhile, Billie Montgomery Cook looks back at her life as a teen in the late 1960s.
One of my fondest memories was growing up as a member of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And at that time, Dr. Harvey Johnson was pastor. So most of the kids my age knew the routine. We knew that Reverend Johnson got up to preach about 12:30, and he probably end somewhere around 5 after 1 or 10 after 1. So as he stood to take his place in the pulpit, we would sneak out of church and go to the end of the block to Wilson's store. Mr. Wilson had the best hot dogs in the world.
Just a sampling of the many fond memories of life in Portsmouth, Virginia, not so very long ago. For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
And next Sunday's event is titled Meet Me at Kelly's Cab Stand, an afternoon of remembering. I am honored to be the moderator of this audience-driven discussion. Come share your memories or come learn more about Portsmouth's African-American history. It's next Sunday, October the 15th, from 2 until 3:30 at the Portsmouth Neighborhood Facility Recreation Center, 900 Elm Street in Portsmouth, followed by a reception right next door at the Portsmouth Colored Community Library Museum, and we sure hope to see you there. Want to say congratulations to the winners of the Virginia Beach Forum tickets to go see Philip J. Hirschkopf, James Williams of Hampton, Mark Askew of Norfolk, and Vanetta Covell of Virginia Beach. So congratulations to you all. Next week on Another View, our roundtable pundits with wit and wisdom on the issues facing our nation today. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Victor Bowen is our audio engineer, and Kamaria Mason answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Thank you so very, very much for listening to Another View.